Hey there, and welcome back to Happily Ever Anxious, the channel that is all about managing your social anxiety while at the Walt Disney World theme parks. My name is Brittany, and in this series, I am going to go through my top 10 tips for managing social anxiety while in the parks. And in this particular video, I'm going to give you tips number 1 and 2. And because I'm a very analytical person, because I am very much into giving as much detail as possible, because I want you to be as prepared as possible, we are going to divide the series up into a couple of different videos. So again, this one is tips 1 and 2, and let's go ahead and get started. I have my notes here. I am ready to go because I do want to really help you manage your social anxiety while in the parks by giving you, helping you learn from my experiences while I have been in the parks a multitude of times. So my very first tip for managing your social anxiety while at Disney World is something that you've probably heard before. However, I'm going to put my own little spin on it because, again, we're dealing specifically with social anxiety. So my first tip is to avoid visiting Disney World during those peak times. And again, I'm going to talk about this in detail and tell you exactly why you should enjoy or avoid these times, what I consider to be peak times, and also when you should visit instead. So why should you avoid what are considered to be the peak visiting times at Walt Disney World? Well, number one, peak times mean high crowds, mean lots of people, mean lots of noises and sounds. And really for us, what that means is there are also long lines, right? So unfortunately, Disney World is notorious for having long lines. It seems like you're always going to be standing in a line, the line to get through security, the line to get through the gate. And then of course, every time you want to ride an attraction or watch a show, there's going to be a line for that as well. So that's one of the things that those of us with social anxiety are going to have to learn how to navigate, is being in those lines. However, during the most peak times of the year, those lines are going to be extra long, and there are going to be even more of them. And so for me personally, this can make what could possibly be a very enjoyable trip a little less enjoyable, only because I'm dealing with having to be in such close proximity with other people. And when you have social anxiety, when you really don't want to be that close, this can be an issue. So that's reason number 1 why you want to avoid just those peak times of the year. Also, another reason is if you are unfamiliar with the parks, trying to navigate in the midst of these large crowds can be very overwhelming. I live about 10 minutes away from Disney, and so I've been in the parks hundreds of times. I really do love Disney. And I know that for me, if I were coming to this park for the very first time or the first couple of times and did not really know how to navigate, it would be quite overwhelming and would kind of stir up some of that anxiety in me. And then I would have to kind of try to manage that as best as possible. So in my opinion, you don't want your first trip to Disney World or your first trip in a long time to be during one of those high attendance or one of those times where they have the highest level of crowds. So when is peak season? And so let's go through this in as much detail as I can give you. There are going to be several times of the year where Disney crowds are going to be at an all-time high. However, probably the most crowded time is going to be during winter break, that late December week of Christmas and New Year's. Disney actually sells out during these times, specifically on Christmas Day at Magic Kingdom and on New Year's Day at Epcot. So I personally have never gone to Disney on Christmas Day or Epcot on New Year's Day. And that really is the reason why. Well, that's one of the reasons why. This is actually also when ticket prices are the highest on New Year's at Magic Kingdom, or excuse me, Epcot on New Year's and Magic Kingdom on Christmas Day. And I'm just not willing to pay more money to visit a park when it's going to be so crowded that I just won't have an enjoyable time. But that's going to be the most crowded, most amount of people. They tend to always sell out on those 2 days at those two parks. Also, basically, I would say anytime when there's a major holiday. So I already mentioned Christmas, New Year's Eve, or New Year's, well, really New Year's Eve, not necessarily New Year's Day, but also Thanksgiving, the day before Thanksgiving and the day after are going to be super crowded. And again, not only are park tickets going to be a little bit more expensive than they normally would be, but the crowd levels are going to be at an all-time high. Also, I would say during spring break, which is also actually like a pretty large span of time, but really we're talking about from mid-March through most of April is when you're going to see those higher crowd levels, particularly with kids and with younger kids. So one thing about Disney World is, of course, you're going to see a lot of kids in the parks on any given day. But during spring break, because it is such a family-friendly theme park, particularly in Magic Kingdom, you are going to see a ton more strollers, a lot more teenagers, a lot more school-age kids, because this is that week that they have off during the school year. And again, a lot of families are going to be traveling to the parks for spring break. And again, we're not just talking about 1 week, but we're talking from about mid-March through the majority of April. Another time that I would avoid as far as it being peak season is really just going to be any major holiday or any even federal holiday where most people have either the Friday or the Monday off from work and can benefit from having a long weekend. So think Veterans Day, Labor Day, that kind of thing, where the holiday is always on a Monday or a Friday. Crowd levels are going to be higher during those time periods as well, because people do want to be in the parks when they have that extra day off, particularly locals who really don't have to travel far in order to spend some extra time in the parks. So those would be the times that I would avoid. The flip side of that would be, if you're not going to go during those high peak times, when would I advise you to actually visit the parks? Well, there are a couple of times that tend to see some lower crowd levels. And the first time is going to be January right up until the spring break season. So January through about early March. So when we get to January, it's actually a pretty great time to visit, because not only are the holiday crowds, that winter break crowd, they're back at home, they're back at work, but you also benefit from pretty much having some cooler weather, as cool as it does get in Orlando. That's what you're going to experience in January. And it can get, I don't want to say pretty cold, because that really is relative, and compared to living in a place like Minnesota, which I was for a year, Orlando gets nothing like that. It just doesn't happen. So maybe we're talking about getting down to about the 30s in January/February. So you do get to experience some cooler temperatures as opposed to the blaring sun, and those crowd levels do start to go down after winter break. So January, February, but again, avoiding holidays like Martin Luther King Jr. Day would be advisable. A second window of time that I think is a great time to visit is from about late August through October. So late August is great because School-age kids are going back to school, summer break is over, and you're not going to see as many people traveling to the parks as you would either during the summer or, like I said, during spring break or winter break. And then you start to get a little bit of the cooler weather during that time of the year versus summertime or in the spring. So you do get that benefit as well. However, it's not going to be as cool as it is January and February. The third time of year that I would say is a great time for those of us with social anxiety to visit, if you cannot go during January, right after the new year begins, or right after students go back to school in August, would actually be during the summer. So June and July. Even though it's going to be really hot outside, 90s, high 90s on any given day, it's not going to be as bad when it comes to crowds, except for maybe the 4th of July. And this is because a lot of people just cannot stand to be in the Florida heat all day in the summer. So a lot of locals kind of avoid going to Disney during this time, even though we live here in Florida. Even for some of us, the sun can be pretty unbearable during those hot summer months. So you won't see as many of those crowds during the day in the parks. And then there are going to be some other people who choose to vacation somewhere else instead of Orlando or the Disney theme parks. So you do get that benefit, but the crowds are going to be a little bit higher than they would be during those other off-peak times, like I said, the January through early March or the August through October. So again, tip number one, in my opinion, is to just try to travel during those off-peak times, because it does become a little bit easier to handle your social anxiety when the crowd levels just are not as high as they are as opposed to during some of those higher peak times. And then my second tip that kind of piggybacks off of that is to try to go to the parks during the week versus during the weekend. So during the week, and actually I don't mean Monday through Friday, but I actually mean Sunday through Thursday. Those are going to be the times where you experience lower crowds, because on Sundays, unless there is a holiday that Monday, Sundays are when people are traveling back to wherever they came from. And then Fridays tend to be when people are coming into town for the weekend. So that Sunday through Thursday is probably going to be your best bet versus Friday and Saturday. And this is for a couple of different reasons. Number one, what you're going to experience is that you're going to see a lot more locals that are going to the theme parks on the weekends versus during the week, because of course we're in school and we just don't have access to the parks, can't get to the parks during the week the way that we can on the weekends. So you're going to see some slightly lower crowds during the week versus the weekends. And so that's great if you have social anxiety, because during the weekends, particularly if there is an Epcot festival going on, the crowds can be quite heavy because you've got the locals, you have people who came in from out of town for those crowds, but you probably are going to want to stay away, Epcot in particular, on those weekend days. I would also say that it is better to visit the parks during the week versus the weekend because it is a little bit cheaper then as well. Your ticket prices may be a little bit cheaper, but more importantly, if you're staying on property, those hotel rates are going to be a little bit cheaper if you're checking in or staying on a Sunday through a Thursday versus Thursday night through the weekend. So those are my first two tips for managing your social anxiety while you're at the Disney World theme parks. Go ahead and go to the next video to hear tip number 3. I'll see you there.